I remember the moment I realized something was wrong. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. It was the way the room went quiet just for a second too long. I had just walked into my daughter's kitchen, still holding the small container of lentil soup I had made that morning. The kind she used to love when she was younger. I could hear voices before I stepped in, low and hurried, like they were trying to fold their words into something smaller. Then the silence. My daughter, Madeline, turned first. Her smile came quickly, too quickly, like she had been waiting for it. "Oh, Mom, you're early." I stood there for a moment longer than necessary. The smell of garlic and onions filled the air, but underneath it there was something else, something unsettled. "I said I'd come by around noon," I replied gently. "It's just 11:30, she said, brushing her hands against her jeans. "We didn't expect you yet." That word lingered. I stepped further in and saw my son Hendrix leaning against the counter, his arms crossed in a way that felt more defensive than relaxed. He didn't meet my eyes right away. When he did, it was brief. "Careful." "Hi, Mom," he said. There was nothing wrong with his voice. And yet, everything felt wrong. I placed the soup on the counter between us. The lid made a soft click as it settled. "I didn't realize I needed an appointment to visit my own children," I said lightly, trying to soften whatever tension I thought I was imagining. Madeline laughed. "Too fast, too bright." "Of course not, you know you're always welcome." But her eyes flickered toward Hendrix, and Hendrix looked away. That was the first moment I felt it. Not suspicion exactly, not yet, just distance. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that grows quietly like a crack in a wall you only notice when the light hits it a certain way. At 60 years old, you learn to recognize silence, not just the absence of sound, but the presence of something unspoken. And that day, standing in my daughter's kitchen, I felt like I had walked into the middle of a conversation I was never meant to hear. Before that day, my life had been simple, predictable in the way I had grown to appreciate. I lived alone in the house my husband and I had bought 35 years ago. After he passed, I kept everything the same for a long time. His chair by the window, the small crack in the hallway wall he always said he'd fix. Even the old clock that ticked just a little too loudly at night. There was comfort in those things. My days followed a rhythm. I woke early before the sun had fully risen, made tea, sat by the window and watched the streets slowly come to life. I knew the sound of every neighbor's car, the pattern of footsteps on the sidewalk, the way the light moved across the living room floor by mid-morning. It was quiet, but it wasn't lonely. Not really. I had my children. Madeline lived 10 minutes away in a neat little house with a garden she struggled to maintain but insisted on keeping. Hendrix lived a bit farther across town, but he visited often enough. Sunday dinners had been our tradition for years. Even after their father passed, we kept it going. I cooked, they came, we talked, simple, familiar, safe. Madeline had always been the more expressive one. She filled silence easily, sometimes too easily. Hendrix was quieter, more measured like his father. He chose his words carefully, and when he spoke, you listened. They were different, but they were close. Or at least I believed they were. Looking back now, I try to pinpoint when things began to change. It wasn't sudden. It never is. It started with small things. Madeline canceling Sunday dinner once, then twice. Hendrix arriving late, then leaving early. Phone calls that felt shorter. Laughter that didn't quite reach the same depth. At the time, I told myself it was life. People get busy, people grow. That's what I believed. That's what I chose to believe. After that day in the kitchen, I tried to push the feeling aside. I sat at the table while Madeline reheated the soup I had brought. She moved quickly, almost nervously, opening cabinets, closing them again as if she had forgotten what she was looking for. Hendrix stayed by the counter, watching, not me, not exactly, just watching. "So," I said, folding my hands in front of me, "what were you two talking about when I came in?" Madeline paused just for a fraction of a second. "Oh, nothing important," she said, "just stuff." "Stuff," I repeated softly. Hendrix cleared his throat. "Work things," he added. "You don't even work together," I said, my voice still calm, still gentle. Another pause, another glance between them, and then Madeline smiled again. "It's really nothing, Mom." There it was again, nothing, such a small word, such a heavy one. I nodded as if I accepted it. Because what else was I supposed to do? Press harder, demand answers? That wasn't who I was, not then. We ate lunch together, but it felt different. Conversations drifted and fell apart before they could settle. Every time I looked up, I caught one of them looking at the other. Not in the way siblings do, not casually, but carefully, as if they were holding onto something fragile, something that might break if I got too close. When I left, Madeline hugged me a little tighter than usual. "Drive safe, okay?" she said. I smiled. I always do. Hendrix walked me to the door. For a moment, it was just the two of us. He opened the door, then hesitated. "Mom," he said. I turned slightly. "Yes." He looked like he wanted to say something more, something real, but then he shook his head. "Nothing." "I'll call you later." I nodded again. "Of course." As I walked back to my car, I felt it more clearly than before. That quiet shift, that invisible line being drawn. At 60 years old, you don't expect to feel like an outsider in your own family. But that's exactly what it felt like. Like everyone else had been handed a piece of information and I was the only one left out. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine. The house behind me looked the same as it always had. Neat, familiar. Ordinary, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside it had changed. Something important. Something that involved me but didn't include me. I drove home slowly that day. The ticking clock in my living room felt louder than usual when I stepped inside. And for the first time in years, the silence felt different, heavier, as if it was waiting for something to be said, or something to be discovered. I just didn't know what yet. That evening, the quiet in my house didn't settle the way it usually did. It lingered. I remember standing in the kitchen holding a cup of tea I had already forgotten to drink. The steam had thinned to almost nothing, but I still held it, as if the warmth might steady something inside me. It didn't. I kept replaying the afternoon in my mind. Not the whole thing, just the small moments. The pauses, the glances, the way Madeline's voice tightened around simple words, the way Hendrix stopped himself from speaking. At 60, your memory becomes selective in a very particular way. It doesn't cling to everything, it chooses what feels unfinished. And that day had left something unfinished in me. I set the cup down and walked slowly through the house. The living room looked the same, the curtains slightly open, the chair by the window untouched. My husband's old coat still hanging behind the door, though I hadn't moved it in years. There was comfort in the familiarity. But that night, it didn't feel like enough. I found myself standing by the hallway wall, staring at that small crack he used to talk about fixing. He would run his fingers along it sometimes like he was measuring something invisible. "I'll get to it," he would say. He never did, and I never minded. But now, for the first time, I noticed how it had grown just a little, just enough to see. I ran my fingers along it the same way he used to, and for a brief moment I wondered if this is how things break, not all at once, but slowly, quietly, until one day you finally notice. The next few days passed in a way that felt off. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but I noticed. Madeline didn't call. That by itself wasn't unusual. She had her own life, her own routines, but she always sent a message. A small check-in, a photo of something in her garden usually. That week, nothing. Hendrix did call, but it was brief, too brief. "How are you, Mom?" he asked. "I'm fine," I said. "How are you?" "Busy," he replied. "Work's been a lot." There was a pause, the kind that invites more, but he didn't fill it. "Did you talk to your sister?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Yeah," he said quickly. "She's good." Another pause. I waited. He didn't continue. "I was thinking of making your father's stew this weekend," I said. "You could both come over." Silence again, not long. "But long enough." "I'll check my schedule," he said, that word again, check, as if something needed to be confirmed, as if he wasn't sure, as if someone else might already have plans for him. "Of course," I said. We ended the call soon after. And when I set the phone down, I realized something I didn't want to admit. They weren't just busy. They were careful, careful with their time, careful with their words, careful with me. By Friday, I decided to visit Madeline again, not unannounced this time. I called first. She picked up on the third ring. "Hi, Mom," she said. Her voice sounded normal, almost too normal. "I was thinking of stopping by," I said, "if that's okay." There was a small pause, barely there. "Today, yes, just for a little while." She hesitated, then quickly added, "Actually, today's not great." I frowned slightly, though she couldn't see it. "Is everything all right?" "Yes, of course," she said. "I just have some things to take care of." "What kind of things?" I asked before I could stop myself. Another pause. "Just house stuff," she said. "You know how it is." I did know how it was, or at least I used to. "All right," I said softly. "Maybe tomorrow." "Tomorrow," she repeated, as if testing the word. "I'll let you know, okay?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see that either. "All right." When the call ended, I sat there for a long time, holding the phone in my lap. I wasn't angry, that came later. What I felt then was something quieter, something that settled deeper. I felt excluded. And it wasn't just the visit, it was the hesitation, the way she had to think before saying yes. The way tomorrow sounded like a question, not a plan. That night I didn't sleep well. The clock in the living room seemed louder than ever. Tick, tick, tick. Each second stretching longer than it should. I got up sometime after midnight and walked into the kitchen. The floor was cold under my feet. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need to. I knew this house in the dark. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the sink. And that's when a thought came to me, not fully formed, just a shape, a possibility. What if it wasn't just them? What if other people knew too? The idea felt strange at first. But once it settled, it didn't leave. I thought about the neighbors. Mrs. Carter next door, who always waved when I checked the mail. The young couple across the street who had moved in last year. The mailman, the cashier at the grocery store. Suddenly, I found myself wondering. Had anyone looked at me differently? Had I missed something? The next morning, I went to the grocery store. Not because I needed anything in particular, but because I needed to be around people, to test something. The store was as it always was, bright lights. Soft music playing overhead, the hum of carts moving across the floor. Normal. I walked through the aisles slowly, taking my time. I picked up things I didn't need, put them back, moved on, and then I noticed it. Not something obvious, not a whisper, not a stare. Just a feeling. The cashier, a young man who had seen me countless times before, greeted me with the same polite smile. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," I replied. He scanned my items, efficient, routine, but when I handed him the cash, his hand hesitated slightly. Just for a second, then he looked up at me, not long, not enough to call it a stare, but enough to make me feel seen, in a different way. "Have a nice day," he said. "You too," I replied. I walked out of the store with my bag in hand, my thoughts heavier than before. It was probably nothing, just a moment, just my imagination, but the feeling stayed. By Sunday, neither Madeline nor Hendrix had confirmed dinner. I didn't call them. I didn't remind them. For the first time in years, I didn't set the table. I made something simple for myself, toast, eggs, tea, and I ate alone at the kitchen table. Halfway through the meal, I realized I was listening for something. A car pulling into the driveway, a knock on the door. A phone ringing, but none of it came. The house stayed quiet, and for the first time, it didn't feel like my choice. That afternoon, I decided to do something I hadn't done in a long time. I went through old papers, not intentionally looking for anything. Just moving through the past, I opened drawers I hadn't opened in years. Boxes filled with documents, receipts, old letters, familiar things, safe things, until I reached the bottom drawer of the desk in the study. There, tucked beneath a stack of old insurance papers, was a folder I didn't recognize. Plain, unlabeled. I hesitated before opening it. I'm not sure why, maybe because something in me already knew, not what I would find. But that whatever it was, it mattered. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were documents, official-looking, typed, stamped. My name appeared at the top of the first page, clear, unmistakable. My fingers tightened slightly around the paper. I began to read. And as I did it, that quiet, lingering feeling I had been carrying for days finally took shape. It wasn't just in my head. It wasn't just a feeling. There was something real, something deliberate, something that had been decided without me. I lowered the paper slowly, my hands steady in a way that surprised me, because inside something had already begun to shift. Not panic, not yet. But understanding, the kind that comes quietly, the kind that changes everything. I didn't react right away. That's what I remember most clearly. Not shock, not anger, just stillness. I sat there at the desk, the paper resting lightly in my hands as if it didn't weigh anything at all. But it did. It carried something heavier than words. My name was printed at the top. Beneath it, lines of formal language, legal phrasing, dates, signatures, and near the bottom, Madeline's name, Hendrix's name. Together, I read it again. Slower this time. Carefully, it wasn't a will. It wasn't something I had signed. I knew that immediately. It was an authorization, a form granting them access to my accounts, my property, my decisions. In the event of I stopped reading, my eyes lingered on that phrase. In the event of diminished capacity. The words were clean. Professional, almost gentle, but they pressed into me in a way that felt anything but gentle. Diminished capacity. I sat back in the chair, the wood creaking softly beneath me. At 60, you think you understand how people see you. You accept certain things, slower steps, reading glasses. forgetting where you left your keys once or twice, but this was different. This wasn't concern, this was preparation, and no one had told me. I tried to remember if there had been any conversation, any moment where this had been discussed. Nothing came to mind. No doctor's appointment that had led to this. No family meeting, no gentle suggestion, just silence and signatures. I looked closer. The date, 3 weeks ago, 3 weeks. That was when things had started to feel different. The missed calls, the shortened conversations, the careful glances. I placed the paper back into the folder, but I didn't close it. Not yet, because something inside me was resisting a conclusion I wasn't ready to accept. Maybe there was an explanation, a reasonable one, something I had forgotten, something I hadn't fully understood at the time. I stood up slowly, the chair sliding back with a soft scrape against the floor. The house felt quieter than usual. Even the clock seemed distant. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself another cup of tea, more out of habit than need. My hands moved steadily, too steadily. As if they were trying to convince me that everything was still normal. It wasn't. By late afternoon, I knew I couldn't sit with it any longer. I picked up the phone and called Hendrix. He answered quickly this time. "Hey, Mom." His voice was alert, too alert. "Hendrix," I said, keeping my tone even, "I need to ask you something." A pause. "Okay." I found some documents here at the house. Silence, not confusion, not surprise, just silence. "Documents?" he repeated. "Yes," I said, "with your name on them and your sister S." Another pause, this one longer. I could hear him breathing on the other end. "Mom," he said slowly, "where did you find those?" "In my desk," I replied. "In a folder I've never seen before." He exhaled, a quiet, measured sound. "It's nothing to worry about," he said. Nothing, there was that word again. I closed my eyes for a moment. "If it's nothing," I said softly, "then you won't mind explaining it to me." Another silence, this one heavier. "Mom, maybe we should talk about this in person," he said. "No," I replied more firmly than I expected. "We can talk about it now." I could feel something shifting in me, not anger, but clarity. "I read it, Hendrix," I continued. "I saw what it says." He didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter. "It's just a precaution." "A precaution for what?" I asked. "In case something happens." "What kind of something?" I pressed. "Health-related," he said. "You know, as people get older, I am not incapable," I said, my voice steady. "I didn't say you were," he replied quickly. "But you signed a document that assumes I might be," I said. Another pause, then more carefully, "It's not about assuming, it's about being prepared." "Prepared for me, without me." I walked slowly to the window, looking out at the street I had known for decades. Everything outside looked the same, unchanged, but inside something had already shifted. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. That was the question that mattered more than the document, more than the signatures. Why the silence? Hendrix didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had softened. "We didn't want to upset you." I let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, not quite anything. "So you decided it would be better to do it behind my back?" "It wasn't like that," he said. "Then what was it like?" I asked. There it was again, that pause, that careful space between words. Finally he spoke. "Mom, you've been forgetting things." I turned from the window. "Everyone forgets things." "It's more than that," he said. "Like what?" I asked. He hesitated. "Last month you left the stove on." I frowned slightly. "I turned it off." "Hours later," he said quietly. I tried to recall the moment. There was a flicker of memory, a pot, water, steam, but it felt distant, uncertain. "That happens," I said. "It doesn't mean I can't manage my own life." "I know," he replied. "We're not saying you can't." "Then what are you saying?" "That we're worried," he said. Worried, that word should have felt comforting. But it didn't, because worry when it's shared feels like care. When it's hidden, it feels like judgment. "I'm coming over," I said suddenly. "Mom, I'm coming over," I repeated. This time he didn't argue. "Okay," he said quietly. The drive to Madeline's house felt longer than usual. Every turn, every stoplight, every familiar landmark seemed slightly off, as if I were seeing them from a distance. When I arrived, both of them were already there, waiting. That alone told me something. Madeline opened the door before I even knocked. "Mom," she said, her voice soft, too soft. I stepped inside without answering. Hendrix stood in the living room, arms crossed again, the same posture as before. Defensive, careful, I held the folder in my hand. "I think you both need to explain this," I said, no raised voice, no accusation, just truth. Madeline looked at Hendrix. Hendrix looked at the floor, then finally he spoke. "We were going to tell you, When? I asked. Soon, Madeline said quickly. Before or after something happened to me? I asked. The words landed heavier than I intended, but I didn't take them back. Madeline's eyes filled slightly. Mom, please don't make it sound like that. Then tell me what it sounds like, I said. There was a long silence, and then slowly, piece by piece, the truth began to surface. Madeline was the first to sit down, not because she was weak, but because she couldn't stand still with what needed to be said. She lowered herself onto the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped tightly together, fingers pressed so hard they had lost their color. Hendrix remained standing. He always did that when something was difficult. As if standing gave him more control over the moment. I stayed where I was. The folder still in my hand, waiting not for comfort, not for excuses, just for truth. It started with the doctor, Madeline said quietly, her voice trembled just slightly. What doctor? I asked. She looked up at me, her eyes searching mine. Your last checkup, she said, Doctor Harris. I frowned. I remember the appointment, I said. Routine, blood pressure, nothing unusual. Madeline glanced at Hendrix again, then back at me. You forgot to mention something, she said. My chest tightened, but I kept my face still. What did I forget? I asked. Hendrix spoke this time. He asked you some questions, he said. Simple ones, memory questions. I searched my mind. There were fragments, a list of words, a question about the date, the name of the current president, things like that. I answered them, I said. You struggled, Hendrix replied gently, that word again. Soft words used to carry heavy meanings. I was tired, I said. It was early. It wasn't just that, Madeline added. You repeated yourself a few times. I felt something shift inside me, not fear, something quieter. A discomfort that settled deeper than I wanted it to. That happens, I said again, though this time my voice lacked the same certainty. Mom, Hendrix said, stepping forward slightly. Dr. Harris suggested we keep an eye on things. Keep an eye on things, I repeated. The phrase felt vague, too vague. He mentioned early signs, Madeline said softly. Of what? I asked, but I already knew, or at least I thought I did. Madeline hesitated, then she said it. Cognitive decline. The room didn't react, no sudden silence, no dramatic shift. Just the quiet continuation of something that had already begun. I stood there, holding that phrase in my mind, turning it over, trying to understand where it fit. I'm 60, I said slowly. Not 80. It's not about age, Hendrix replied. It feels like it is, I said. There was a long pause, the kind that doesn't ask to be filled, it simply exists. I would have remembered if the doctor was concerned, I said finally. Madeline's eyes softened. That's just it, Mom, she said. You didn't. The words landed carefully, but they still landed. I looked at her, really looked, not as my daughter, but as someone sitting across from me with information I didn't have. And for the first time, I saw something in her expression I hadn't noticed before. Not guilt, not exactly, but fear, real fear. So you decided, I said slowly, that I couldn't be trusted to know my own situation. That's not what we decided, Hendrix said quickly. Then what did you decide? I asked. That we needed to be prepared, he said, just in case. In case I become incapable, I said. In case you need help, Madeline corrected gently. I let out a small breath. Help doesn't usually come in the form of legal documents signed behind someone's back. Madeline flinched slightly. Hendrix looked away. That was answer enough. You went to a lawyer, I said. Hendrix nodded. Yes. And you signed this. I lifted the folder slightly without telling me. Yes, he said again, no hesitation this time, no softening, just truth. I appreciated that more than I expected, even if it hurt. Why now? I asked. Because we started noticing things, Madeline said. Like what? I pressed. She hesitated, then slowly she began. You missed my birthday lunch. I blinked. I called you, I said. I told you I wasn't feeling well. You called me the next day, she replied softly. You thought it was still the day before. I felt a flicker of something, a memory that didn't fully form. I was confused, I said. Yes, she said gently. Hendrix spoke next. You gave me the same check twice last month, he said. I looked at him. For what? For the plumber, he replied. I frowned. I remember paying him. You did, he said. Twice. Each example was small, manageable, explainable. On its own, none of it felt like enough. But together, they formed something else. A pattern, and patterns are harder to ignore. I'm still capable, I said quietly. No one's saying you're not, Madeline said, but you're preparing for a time when I won't be, I replied. She didn't answer because there was no way to soften that truth. I walked slowly to the chair across from her and sat down. The movement felt heavier than it should have, not physically, but in meaning. At 60, you don't expect to sit down and have your children explain your own mind to you. I wish you had told me, I said after a while. Madeline's eyes filled again. I wanted to, she said. Then why didn't you? She looked down at her hands. Because I was afraid, she whispered. Of what? I asked. Of this, she said, gesturing lightly between us. Of how it would feel for you, for us. I nodded slowly. That's the part you don't get to avoid, I said. Hendrix moved closer, resting his hand briefly on the back of the chair. We're not trying to take anything from you, he said. It feels like you already have, I replied. He didn't argue, because again, there was no way to soften that. What happens now? I asked. The question surprised even me because it wasn't angry, it wasn't defensive, it was practical. Hendrix and Madeline exchanged a glance, then Hendrix spoke. Nothing changes, he said. You keep living your life, we just stay involved. Involved how? I asked. Just aware, Madeline said, aware. Another careful word, another vague one. I looked down at the folder in my hands, then back at them. I want a copy of everything, I said. You can have it, Hendrix replied immediately. And I want to speak to the lawyer myself. Of course, he said. No hesitation, that at least felt honest. The conversation slowed after that. There wasn't much left to say, not because everything had been resolved, but because everything had been revealed, and sometimes that's enough to change the shape of a room. When I stood to leave, Madeline walked me to the door again, just like before, but this time there was no pretending, no overly bright smile, just quiet. Mom, she said softly, we love you. I looked at her, I believed her, that wasn't the problem. I know, I said, and I did, but love, I realized, doesn't always come in a way that feels like love. Sometimes it feels like something being taken. Hendrix followed us to the door. I'll call you tomorrow, he said. I nodded. All right. But as I stepped outside, I knew something had shifted. Not just in them, in me, because now I wasn't just feeling like something was hidden, I knew what it was, and knowing made it heavier. The drive home felt different, not slower, not faster, just clearer. As if a fog had lifted, only to reveal something I wasn't sure I wanted to see. When I stepped into my house, the clock was still ticking. The same as always, but now I noticed something else. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt observant. As if it was watching me, waiting, for what I didn't know yet. But for the first time, I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't just about what they had done. It was about what might be true, and that was the part I wasn't ready to face. That night, I didn't turn on the television. I didn't reach for a book. I didn't even make tea. I just sat in the same chair by the window, the one my husband used to sit in, with my hands resting quietly in my lap. The street outside was dim. A few cars passed now and then, their headlights stretching briefly across the walls before disappearing again. I watched the light move, back and forth, and I thought about what my children had said, not the big words, not cognitive decline, not precaution. But the small things, the moments, the ones I couldn't quite remember clearly, that was what unsettled me the most. Not that they had taken action, but that part of me wasn't entirely sure they were wrong. I tried to go through my day step by step, morning tea. I remembered that, the grocery store, yes, but then there were gaps, nothing dramatic, just softness around the edges like a photograph slightly out of focus. I closed my eyes and pressed my fingers gently against my temples. At 60, you expect your body to change, but your mind. That feels different, more personal, more fragile. Around midnight, I stood up and walked into the kitchen. This time, I turned on the light. The brightness felt almost intrusive. I opened a drawer and took out a small notepad, something simple, nothing special. I placed it on the table and sat down. Then I picked up a pen. If there was something I was missing, I needed to know, not through them, not through their careful explanations, through myself. I wrote the date at the top of the page, slowly, clearly. Then I paused. What now? I wasn't sure, so I started with something simple. A list. 5 things I had done that day. I wrote, made breakfast, went to the store, spoke to Hendrix, visited Madeline, came home. I stared at the list. It looked complete. But it didn't feel complete. There were spaces in between those actions, moments I couldn't fully recall, what I had eaten, what I had said, the exact details. They slipped away when I tried to hold them. I set the pen down. My hands were steady. But my thoughts weren't, and for the first time I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before, Not fear, not panic, but doubt about myself. The next morning I woke earlier than usual. The house was still dark. The clock read 5:12. I sat up slowly listening. Nothing, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the distance. I got out of bed and went straight to the kitchen. The notepad was still there, waiting. I picked it up and read what I had written the night before. The words were mine. The handwriting was mine. But they felt distant, like something I had written a long time ago, not just hours before. I made tea. This time I paid attention to every step, the sound of the kettle, the steam rising, the way the cup warmed my hands. I wanted to anchor myself in something real, something present, because the past day suddenly felt uncertain. By mid-morning I had made a decision. I wasn't going to sit in this house and wonder. I needed to understand, properly, not through fragments, not through assumptions, through facts. I called the doctor's office. Dr. Harris, the same one Madeline had mentioned. The receptionist answered. Her voice was calm, professional. "Good morning, Dr. Harris's office." "Hello," I said. "This is Margaret Collins. I'd like to schedule an appointment." There was a brief pause as she checked the system. "Of course, Mrs. Collins, is this a follow-up?" "Yes," I said, "you could say that." She gave me a time that afternoon, sooner than I expected. I agreed. The hours before the appointment passed slowly. I stayed in the living room, the notepad beside me. Every so often I wrote something down, small things, what time I had breakfast, what I was thinking, even what I was feeling, not in detail, just enough to mark it, to prove to myself that I was present, that I was aware. When it was time to leave, I checked my bag twice. Keys, wallet, phone, everything in place, everything accounted for. I locked the door carefully behind me, listening for the click, making sure it was real. The drive to the clinic was familiar. I had been there many times before, but this time it felt different. Not routine, not casual, it felt significant, as if I were going to confirm something or deny it. I wasn't sure which. The waiting room was quiet. A few people sat scattered across the chairs. Some reading, some staring into space. I took a seat by the window, the same spot I had sat in during my last visit. I remembered that, clearly. That felt like something. "Mrs. Collins," I looked up. A nurse stood by the door, smiling politely. I stood and followed her down the hallway. Each step felt measured, intentional. Dr. Harris was already in the room when I entered. He stood as I walked in. "Margaret," he said warmly, "it's good to see you." I nodded. "Thank you for seeing me on short notice." "Of course," he said, "please sit." I did. He sat across from me, his expression attentive, not rushed, not dismissive. That at least was reassuring. "I'd like to talk about my last visit," I said. He nodded slowly. "All right." "My children mentioned that you had concerns," I continued. He folded his hands lightly. "I discussed some observations with them, yes." "Why not with me?" I asked. The question came out more calmly than I expected. He didn't seem surprised. "I did speak with you," he said gently. "But you seemed unaware of some of the issues we were discussing." I held his gaze. "What issues?" He paused, choosing his words. "Memory lapses, repetition, difficulty with short-term recall." The words were clinical, neutral, but they carried weight. "I want you to be honest with me," I said. "I always am," he replied. "Do you believe I am losing my mental capacity?" He didn't answer immediately, and in that pause I felt the truth before he said it. "I believe," he said slowly, "that there are early signs of cognitive impairment." The room didn't change, the light stayed the same. The sounds outside the door continued, but something inside me shifted, quietly, permanently. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means we need to monitor it," he said. "There are tests we can do, steps we can take." "Is it reversible?" I asked. He hesitated. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "depending on the cause." I nodded slowly, absorbing, processing, not reacting. "And my children," I said, "were they wrong to prepare?" He looked at me steadily. "No," he said. That answer didn't hurt, not in the way I expected, because by then I already understood. When I left the clinic, the air outside felt different, cooler, sharper. As if everything had been outlined more clearly. The sky was the same, the street was the same, but I wasn't. I sat in my car for a long moment before starting the engine. My hands rested on the steering wheel, still steady, still capable, but now there was something else beneath that steadiness. Awareness. At 60 years old, I had thought the distance I felt from my children was something they had created, something they had chosen. But now, sitting there with the doctor's words still settling in my mind, I realized something harder. The distance might not have been theirs alone. I did not go home right away. The engine was running, but I kept my foot on the brake, watching the world move past the windshield as if it belonged to someone else. A woman crossed the street with a child, holding his hand gently but firmly. A man stood outside a shop, checking his watch. A bicycle passed by, the soft hum of its wheels fading into the distance. Everything continued. Nothing had stopped. And yet inside me something had shifted into a quieter place. Not panic, not even fear, not in the way people expect. It was something more measured, an awareness that asked me to pay attention to everything. I finally released the brake and drove, but not toward home. I turned left instead of right, toward the park. It was a place I had gone to many times before, though not recently. My husband used to like the benches near the pond. He said the water had a way of slowing his thoughts. I parked beneath the same tree we used to choose. The branches were thinner now, or perhaps I just noticed more. I stepped out of the car and walked slowly toward the bench. Each step deliberate, not because I was weak, but because I wanted to feel each one. I sat down and placed my hands on my knees. The pond was still. A few ripples near the edge where the wind touched it lightly. I watched them form, spread, disappear. I thought about what the doctor had said. Early signs, such a small phrase. So much contained within it, not a conclusion, not a certainty, just a direction. For a long time I sat there without trying to organize my thoughts. I didn't argue with them, I didn't defend myself, I simply let them come. And what surprised me was not what I felt about myself. It was what I felt about my children. They had been afraid, that much was clear now, not controlling, not manipulative, afraid of losing something they didn't know how to hold on to. Afraid of watching me change in a way they couldn't stop, and instead of speaking, they prepared, quietly, imperfectly, but not without reason. I exhaled slowly, the air felt cool in my lungs. At 60, you don't expect to sit in a park and reconsider your place in your own life. But there I was, doing exactly that. By the time I returned home, the light had shifted. The afternoon had softened into evening. The house greeted me the same way it always did, silent, familiar, waiting, but this time I didn't resist it. I walked in, set my keys down in the same place as always, and went straight to the kitchen. The notepad was still there. I picked it up. Read the lines again, then turn the page. If something was changing, I needed to meet it with something steady, something intentional, not fear, not denial, structure. I wrote at the top of the page, things I will not forget. I paused, then I began. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 60 years old. This is my home. Madeline is my daughter. Hendrix is my son. They love me. I stopped there because that last line mattered, even now, especially now. The next morning, I called Hendrix. This time, my voice was different. Not sharper, not softer, just clearer. Can you come by today? I asked. There was no hesitation. Yes, he said, of course. And Madeline, I added, I'll call her, he said. They arrived together. That in itself said something. When I opened the door, I saw it immediately, the concern in their faces. The careful way they looked at me, not as they used to, but not as strangers either, something in between. Come in, I said. They stepped inside. Hendrix glanced briefly around the house as if checking something. Madeline moved closer to me. How are you? She asked. I'm all right, I said, and for the first time in days that felt true. We sat at the kitchen table. The same place where so many ordinary conversations had taken place over the years. This one was not ordinary, but it didn't need to be dramatic. I saw Dr. Harris, I said. They exchanged a glance, not surprised, just attentive. And, Hendrix asked. He confirmed what you were concerned about, I said. Madeline's eyes lowered slightly. Hendrix remained still. I want to say something before either of you respond, I continued. They both nodded. I understand why you were worried, I said. The words felt steady as they left me. I understand why you took steps to prepare. Madeline looked up at me, her eyes already filling. But I added gently, you should have told me. Hendrix nodded slowly. You're right, he said. Madeline's voice was softer. We didn't know how. I know, I replied. And I don't expect you to have known perfectly. There was a pause, but it wasn't heavy this time. It was open. I'm not going to pretend this isn't difficult, I said. It is. They both listened carefully. I don't know what will happen, I continued. And neither do you. Hendrix nodded again. That's true. But I do know this, I said. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the table. I am still here. My voice didn't rise, but it held something firm. I am still capable of understanding my life, of making decisions, of being part of what happens next. Madeline reached for my hand. I know, she said quietly. Then include me, I replied. The words settled between us. Simple, direct, necessary. Hendricks spoke next. We will, he said, no hesitation, no qualification, just agreement. We talked for a long time after that, not about fear, not about worst-case scenarios, but about practical things, the documents, what they meant, what they didn't mean, the boundaries, the choices, for the first time since this had begun. I didn't feel like something was being done to me, I felt like something was being faced, together. Before they left, Madeline hugged me again. This time it wasn't tight with guilt, it was steady, present. Hendricks lingered a moment longer at the door. We'll figure this out, he said. I looked at him, at both of them. I know, I replied. That night I returned to the chair by the window. The street outside was quiet again. The clock ticked, steady, unchanging, but the silence in the room. It no longer felt like something waiting to be discovered. It felt like something that had already spoken and been heard. At 60, I had begun to notice that people around me knew something I didn't. What I hadn't understood then was that part of that knowing was something I needed to learn too, not from fear, but from acceptance. The days that followed did not transform overnight. There was no sudden clarity, no clean sense of control. Instead, there was something quieter, a rhythm we had to learn again, together. The first change was small, but intentional. Madeline began coming by twice a week, not to check on me, not in the way I had feared, but to sit, to share tea, to talk about ordinary things, her garden, her neighbor's dog, a recipe she had tried and failed at. At first, I noticed the way she observed me, subtly, the pauses between my words, the way I reached for things, but over time those observations softened. They became less like monitoring and more like presence. Hendricks approached things differently, that was always his way. He brought structure, quietly. Without announcing it, he helped me organize the kitchen drawers one afternoon. Just to make things easier, he said. I didn't argue because I understood. He wasn't rearranging my life, he was trying to make it steadier. We created small systems, a calendar on the wall, a place for keys that never changed, labels on certain cabinets, not because I couldn't remember, but because it removed the need to question, and that I realized mattered more than I expected. I continued writing in the notepad every day. At first, it felt like a task, something I was doing to prove a point, but gradually it became something else. A record, not of what I might forget, but of what I still knew. Some days were clear, sharp. I could recall conversations, details, even small moments from years ago. Other days felt softer, like walking through a room where the edges weren't fully defined. But even then, I was aware of the softness, and that awareness was something I held on to. One afternoon, about 2 weeks later, I experienced something that unsettled me more than anything before, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet. I had gone to the kitchen to make tea, a simple act, one I had done thousands of times. I filled the kettle, placed it on the stove, turned the knob, waited, and then I stood there looking at it, unsure. Not of what I was doing, but of whether I had already done it. I couldn't remember turning the knob, I couldn't remember if the flame was on before. I leaned closer. Checked, it was on. The water was heating. Everything was as it should be, and yet, for a moment, I didn't trust that I had made it happen. It lasted only seconds, but it stayed with me longer than I wanted it to, that quiet doubt, that small break in certainty. I turned off the stove, sat down at the table, and wrote it in the notepad, every detail, not because I wanted to dwell on it, but because I needed to acknowledge it. That evening when Madeline came by, I told her, not dramatically, not as a complaint, just as a fact. She listened, her expression steady, concerned, yes, but not alarmed. Thank you for telling me, she said. That was all, no panic, no overreaction, just presence. Later that week, Hendricks and I went to see the lawyer together, the same one they had gone to before. This time I sat in the chair, not as a subject but as a participant. The lawyer spoke clearly, explained the documents, what they allowed, what they didn't, how decisions would be made, and when. I asked questions, many of them, some repeated, but no one rushed me, no one dismissed me, and that mattered. We made adjustments, small but important ones, clauses that required my input as long as I was able to give it, conditions that delayed certain authorities unless absolutely necessary, not perfect control, but not absence either. When we left the office, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not relief, but balance. The world outside hadn't changed, but my place in it felt more defined. The truth, I realized, was not something I could fight, not entirely, because part of it lived within me, but that didn't mean I had to surrender to it completely either. One Sunday we returned to our old tradition. Dinner at my house. I cooked, slowly, carefully, following the recipe step by step, checking things more than once, but I cooked. Madeline set the table, Hendrix brought a bottle of wine, we sat together just like before. But not exactly the same. There were moments when I searched for a word a little longer than usual, moments when I paused to recall something simple, and I saw them notice. Of course they did, but they didn't interrupt, they didn't correct, they waited. And most of the time, I found my way back. After dinner, we sat in the living room, the clock ticking softly in the background, the same sound that had once felt heavy, now it felt steady. I was afraid, Madeline said suddenly. I looked at her. She wasn't looking at me, she was looking at her hands. Of what? I asked. Of losing you, she said. The words were simple, but they carried everything. I nodded slowly. I was afraid too, I admitted. They both looked at me. Of being left out, I continued. Of becoming something you decided for me. Hendrix exhaled quietly. We didn't want that, he said. I know, I replied. And now, I paused. Now I understand a little more. The room settled into a quiet that didn't feel empty. It felt shared. At 60, I had believed that the distance I felt was something being done to me, but now I saw it differently. It wasn't just distance. It was transition, messy, imperfect, but real. And perhaps that was something we were all learning to navigate in our own ways. The first time I forgot something important after all of this, I didn't panic. That surprised me, because a few weeks earlier that same moment might have unsettled me in a way I couldn't control. But this time it was different. It was a Tuesday morning. The light had just begun to settle across the kitchen floor, stretching in that quiet way it always had. I stood by the counter, holding my cup of tea, watching the same familiar patterns. There was comfort in that. Still, always, I had planned to call Madeline that morning. I remember thinking about it clearly the night before. I even wrote it down in the notepad. Call Madeline 10 a.m. Simple, direct, something I would not forget, but I did. I went through the morning as usual, tea, toast, a few lines in the notepad. I even stepped outside briefly just to feel the air. Everything felt in place. Nothing seemed missing until the phone rang. It startled me just slightly, not because of the sound, but because something in me recognized it before I fully understood why. I picked it up. Hello, Mom, Madeline's voice came through, gentle but carrying a small weight beneath it. I was waiting for your call. I closed my eyes for a moment, not in frustration, not in shame, just acknowledgement. I forgot, I said. There was a pause. But not the kind I had come to fear, not heavy, not filled with something unspoken, just a space. That's okay, she said, and I believed her, because of the way she said it, not dismissing, not excusing, just accepting. I wrote it down, I added quietly. I know, she said, you told me you would. There was no disappointment in her voice, only understanding. I'm still learning, I said, and so am I, she replied. We spoke for a while after that, about small things, her garden. A recipe she wanted to try again, nothing significant, and yet everything about it felt significant. Because for the first time, forgetting something didn't feel like failure. It felt like part of something I was learning to live with. Later that day, I sat with my notepad again. I turned to the page where I had written the reminder. Call Madeline, 10 a.m. I looked at it for a long time, then I added one more line beneath it. Forgot, called later, everything okay? That felt important, not just the forgetting, but the recovery. At 60, I had believed that control was something you either had or lost, but now I understood something different. Control changes. It doesn't disappear all at once, it shifts, and if you're willing to meet it where it is, you can still hold onto parts of it. The weeks continued like that, not perfect, but steady. Some days I needed reminders, some days I didn't, some conversations came easily, others took a little more time, but I stayed present, I stayed aware, and most importantly, I stayed involved. Madeline stopped watching me the way she used to, not because she didn't care, but because she trusted me more, not to be perfect, but to be honest. Hendrix still organized things, still checked in quietly, but now he asked before making changes, and I answered, sometimes yes. Sometimes no. We had found something between us, not what we had before, but something that worked now. One evening, as I sat by the window again, I noticed the crack in the hallway wall, the one my husband had always said he would fix. I hadn't paid much attention to it lately, but that night I walked over to it, ran my fingers along it again just like before. It had grown, slightly, not enough to break anything, but enough to see, and for the first time. I didn't think of it as something unfinished or neglected. I thought of it as something that had endured, something that had changed quietly over time without collapsing. I stepped back and looked at it, then I smiled, not because it was perfect, but because it was still there. That night I wrote one more thing in my notepad, not a reminder, not a record, just a thought. Things can change and still remain. At 60, I had started to feel like the people around me knew something I didn't, and in a way, they did, but what I didn't understand then was that this wasn't a secret being kept from me. It was a truth that was slowly reaching me, in pieces, in moments, in quiet realizations. And once I allowed myself to see it, to face it, to be part of it, it no longer felt like something I was excluded from. It felt like something I was living through with them. I still wake up early, I still make my tea. I still sit by the window and watch the light move across the room. Some days are clearer than others, some memories come easily, some take a little longer, but I am still here, still aware, still part of my own life, and that is enough. If you were in my place, would you have faced the truth the way I did, or would you have held on a little longer to what felt certain? If this story touched something in you, stay a little while longer. There are more stories like mine waiting to be told.